Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Baseball's been a big part of my life. I feel like it got me to where I am today. I was sponsored to play growing up because we couldn't afford it, so it really means a lot to me to keep athletes healthy. I played as long as I could. It got me through college, and I was always injured. And it got me thinking, I'm doing everything my coaches tell me, everything my strength coaches tell me, so why am I injured every season? So looking back on that, I kind of got to reflect, and now I understand why these things are happening. So hopefully I can give you some good actionable information to help prevent these injuries, so hopefully the athletes can last longer and not go through what we've all gone through. After I stopped playing baseball, I went through a couple specialized skill sets with manual muscle testing, so it's all about neuromuscular, and we'll get to that a lot more with the motion capture talk. I also learned a lot about the physics of resistance mechanics. So I teach in physical therapy clinics. I've got a lot of PTs that have their master's or doctorate, a lot of orthopedic surgeons. So to be able to teach them to better help their patients, it's an incredible experience. So I've had a lot of stroke victims who will regain function after a decade, a lot of traumatic brain injuries. So I stepped away from baseball for that time because I was so frustrated because, again, I felt like I had to outwork everyone, and I'm pretty sure I did, but I always broke down. So helping these rare medical conditions and special cases, I started getting more kids coming in that were injured. So at that point, pivoted back to baseball, and I thought, well, there's got to be a way that we can offload stress externally. So this is my facility. I opened it up in 2011 or 2012. So we got about a 12,000 square foot facility. So some of those clients, I do a lot of work in clinical settings. So again, teaching for physical therapists because it's a skill set that they don't have. So we talk about corrective exercise a lot, and I'm going to explain why corrective exercise is kind of a myth, and it's a neurological issue that we can work on. The young man on the Pilates reformer was told that he would never walk again, and I got him walking again. So that's actually my brother. He was hit head on his motorcycle. So that was the first time that I was able to apply this skill set and really kind of start out with micro progressions and get him back to functioning. The kid that's doing some trunk rotation, we were able to cancel his Tommy John surgery. He was scheduled for surgery. MRI was inconclusive. Surgeons don't get paid to not do surgery, so keep that in mind. Anytime that they tell you need to go under the knife, always get a second opinion. He's been pain-free, started using the Kinetic Arm, and he's fine. Young man that's coming down with the trunk rotation, excuse me, we'll circle back on this with one of the athletes I'll show later. He won Freshman of the Year in the Gulf South Conference. I only took on 2 clients. I just usually don't have the time. We didn't do a single bit of stretching. We didn't do a single bit of distance running. We didn't do any heavier Olympic lifting. He threw 10 complete game shutouts, no arm injuries at all. So we'll talk a little bit about that too, and how some of those things can contribute to the injuries that we're seeing. Pain doesn't have to be part of the process. The client in the wheelchair, incredible individual, very little muscle function. So to be able to help people like this and get people walking again, to figure out what's going on with baseball players, I see a lot of the correlation causation, so I'd love to share as much of that as possible as I can today. And then Naz Nunez, who just won the Rule 5 draft, Futures game, those are my only 2 clients. So again, we didn't do any stretching, we didn't do any heavy lifting, we definitely didn't do any Olympic lifting or barbell silliness. This is, my wife always told me I should be taking pictures. We've got dozens more. I'm just not a picture guy. To me, I'd rather, a lot of people on social media, they'll say like, I did this. I didn't do this for any of these athletes. A lot of them, their trainers brought them to me because they couldn't figure out what was wrong with them. So same thing, when the PTs and the orthopedic surgeons can't figure out what's wrong with their patient, they'll send them to me. So that's why I got a lot of these athletes. But you'll see a lot of title belts. I've had a lot of world champions in multiple sports. I've fought and competed in submission grappling, some Muay Thai boxing for around 15 years. So at this point, I can say I've either had or rehabbed somebody through just about every injury you can think of. So the current state of baseball, we know that around 50% of adolescents participating in baseball experience elbow or shoulder pain at some point during a competitive season, making them not just double, but 7.5 times more likely to have an overuse injury down the road. So to me, that doesn't sound like a success. And baseball has the greatest injuries in high school athletics, resulting in surgery, 32.3%, with 60.3% of these injuries due to overuse and fatigue. Does that sound like a success to anyone? No. So by the time you're already getting these athletes, they're compromised. It's just to what extent. So that's why we've really got to be careful with how we're training them. And also, injuries to the elbow and shoulder comprise of 53 to 63% of all injuries in baseball because of that repetitive microtrauma, that repetitive strain. So no matter how good your arm care program is, and we'll touch on this again later, if you have any issue from the ground up, you're always going to exceed the stress threshold of this connective tissue, okay? So again, you can have the strongest arm in the world. If you've got dysfunction at the foot, the hip, or the trunk, this is going to go. That's just it. Even without pain, regularly pitching with fatigue has been associated with 36% greater odds of injury requiring surgery. I don't know how accurate that is, but it's pretty alarming. So again, we're going to talk about some of the training and things that could lead to fatigue and contribute to injuries. Because again, like the two athletes I've had and a lot that I've had in the past, I've had a lot of Major League Baseball clients fly in because their 24 medical professionals on staff can't figure out what's wrong with them because they just don't have that skill set. So also from baseball perspectives, we saw elbow and shoulder injuries were up 44% from just a year ago, and they're also more serious. Why are they dictating and designing the Pitch Smart program for these youth baseball players? If you can't prevent preventable injuries with 24 medical professionals, the fanciest, most expensive technology, that's a big problem. So we've got to step back and think, what's all this BS that we can cut out to keep these athletes healthy? And again, I've had several of them travel to my facility. It's not a complex issue, but they overthink it. A lot of people talk about, what is Tom Brady's trainer doing? And I was asked that on a podcast one time, and right away it clicked. I said, wait a second. It's not what he's doing, it's what he's not doing. He's not doing the heavy Olympic lifts. He's not doing the heavy barbell BS. And we'll get into why those are going to contribute to injuries. But I always say question everything. So when we talk about stretching, some of these positions, if I'm going up over here, we're causing impingement at the glenohumeral joint. And if you do what you always done, you get what you always got, and that's going to be arms breaking down. So I'm not saying that stretching is bad. I'm not damning stretching. I'm just saying, there's a time and place for it. But right before you throw, if you're causing impingement and shutting things down, it's probably not the best thing to do. So we'll go over some positional isometrics as well, so we can actually turn things on and then neurologically prepare them for that movement rather than shutting them down and stretching them out. The dead hang stretch, we see a lot of guys have that anterior tilt or that kind of depressed scapula. So a lot of them don't even have full range in glenohumeral flexion. So if we've already got that muscle tension from pec minor pulling this tight, and then we're trying to jam this, not only are we causing more impingement from a position you can't even get to, hanging, with your full body weight, but if we're doing this with kids, think about where those forearm flexors attach, right on that medial epicondyle, and that's where we get little league elbow. So we already have a lot of stress from throwing, and then we're stretching and shutting them down, right? So then from there, if we're doing these hangs, especially before they throw, we're already exceeding what that tissue can handle in that growth plate. And I've seen a lot of avulsion fractures, and again, pain does not have to be part of the process. So we've just got to do a better job. Hamstring stretches. After all the years of stretching your hamstrings, why are they hanging down behind your knees? Because muscles don't stretch, and muscle tension is a good thing. So we've got to step back and change what we're doing. Things like the groin stretch, and then we've got the sleeper stretch. So it's interesting, we're always trying to stretch into external rotation. So with all the stretching external rotation, why is nobody's hand going down and hitting their butt? Because there's a limit to what's efficient. So if we get more external rotation, naturally, you're going to have less internal rotation. So when we talk about, glenohumeral internal rotation deficit, if we're cranking this into external rotation, yeah, you're going to have less internal rotation. It's just the way it works. Your shoulder's not on a swivel. It's not going to, spin around 360 degrees. And we've got to remember that you've got a lot of ligaments in there that are holding that in place, not to mention the rotator cuff. So it's a very, very complex structure. So when we're continuously forcing that into positions that we can't anatomically get to on our own, that's where things break. So it's also, end layback, right? So we know that peak stress happens at end range, So we've got to take stress off these tissues every chance we get. When we talk about mobility training, people always want to increase range of motion. They say they're lengthening muscles. Have you ever seen muscles just hang down because they're slack? No. So if we're not changing the attachment sites, but we think we're making the muscles longer, it doesn't really make sense if you think about it. So if you loosen the bolts and drive your car fast, what happens? Things are going to fall apart. It's kind of like before you go run sprints, you loosen up your shoelaces. It doesn't make sense. So remember, muscle stabilized joints, and we're gonna touch on that a lot more as well. So if we do create any kind of laxity or hypermobility, and then we have to stop and change joints, we've got to remember the way the structure in the muscular system was designed. All right, so if we're trying to increase range, have we prepared to train in that new range? Do we even have strength to support it? So again, muscle stabilized joints. So when we're stretching, and you can cause muscle inhibition and destabilize the structure in as little as 15 to 20 seconds. So again, I'm not stretching, I'm just saying the dosage determines the poison, and always think, what is the goal? So some major concerns with it, especially from a young age, is hypermobility. So we're actually over in College Station a couple nights ago, had the pleasure of working with some high school athletes. Some were pretty hypermobile, and that's probably what led to, the ACL tears and the way they're trying to train, and they're trying to do heavy lifting in ranges where anatomically they're just not strong. So we're going to go over that as well as like an active, force production curve. So we've got to think, is that range of motion even necessary for that sport or activity? In baseball, we stretch just as much, if not more, than any other sport. And when you get injured, what do they tell you? Stretch. If you bang your head against the wall and get a headache, do you keep banging your head against the wall? It kind of doesn't make sense, right? So again, what is the purpose and what is the goal of this stretching? And has there been an adequate time to develop strength within the newfound range? I've had athletes sent over from one of the top orthopedic surgeons programs, a lot of other pretty well-known physical therapists. And when they come to see me, they've been cleared to throw because they stretched and smashed and beat up, the range of motion. Range of motion tells you nothing but range of motion. It could be a pathological issue, it could be neurological, it could be structural. And then you got to remember, when they're coming back from an injury, neurologically, the brain is going to tighten things up for a reason, because it knows that going into that new range, that's a dangerous position. So these guys get cleared to throw, they come to see me, they still have pain, and I ask them, do they look at your trunk? No. Do they look at your hip? No. Do they assess foot function or see if your lower leg can even hold a positional contraction? No. So why are these guys cleared? So that's a big limitation in the skill set that the PTs have. So that's a big problem. So a lot of guys will go through and we'll see they have no active trunk rotation to their throwing side. Sometimes it could be to the other side. A lot of these guys also have no active internal or external rotation on their drive leg. So with every degree of motion that we lose down here, we try to pick it up the chain. And then we get into all this, T-spine obsession. The whole spine's rotating. Unless you got a cage in your lumbar spine, just say trunk rotation. It sounds cool and trendy, but, and then are you sacrificing the muscle strength and contractile velocity for mobility? So again, if you're going passively into a range that you can't actively get to, are you stable there? Probably not. So we've got to be really careful with how we're applying force when we're training, because we can really prevent injuries with just some simple things. As far as range of motion, I want this to be the biggest takeaway, if nothing else, because when these kids come to you and ask you, why aren't we doing what these people do on social media? This is the best way to think about it, is that muscle stabilized joints. So again, if we're destabilizing that structure with beating the crap out of the muscles with a foam roller lacrosse ball, what is the goal? Remember that muscles tighten up for a reason. Your brain's not playing a joke on you. So it senses there's instability, it's gonna tighten that up, it's a protective mechanism. So when we violate that protective mechanism, now we're more vulnerable to injury. Also, structure dictates function. So we'll have some good pictures of that. And always thinking, because structure dictates function, there's a lot of ranges that we shouldn't be training in and applying load. We also shouldn't be stretching into those positions as well, because once you open up range there, is the next joint prepared to handle that range? So that's probably why we see a lot more ACL tears and hamstring injuries, not to mention other areas of the body. And then we'll also talk about trunk rotation and the structure of the spine. Mobility without stability equals vulnerability. So if we're forcing limbs and joints into these ranges, and we don't even know if we can hold a positional contraction, that's a recipe for disaster. And again, I get a lot of athletes sent from orthopedic surgeons, physical therapists, and they may have stretched and smashed and gotten them that range of motion, and we'll see if they can hold a positional contraction, and they have nothing. And I went through that after an injury, and we'll get into that as well. So again, having had to rehab somebody through just about every injury you can think of, it's given me a lot of insight and a lot of hands-on experience. So if we look at how muscle stabilize joints, at end range, we have the least amount of force production. So that's why you typically don't want to go all the way down on a bicep curl or all the way down on a pull-up. So as far as the sarcomeres or the muscle fibers, but at every joint, the further you get from that mid-range, so here we could say 90 degrees, your force output goes down. So this is a big training consideration with heavy squats. If we know we're the weakest at the lowest part of the range, we should either offload that, or why are we doing those in the first place? So for your tall guys, remember, we've got these longer levers. Mechanically, we're just never going to be good at squats, and that's okay. So when I hear that a squat is an assessment, why? It's not really required in baseball. And then we'll also, so this is it. Structure dictates function. Seated 90-90 hip stretch is the best way to tear your hip labrum. Let that sink in for a minute. Why are we doing it? In baseball, when are we doing this? We're not. Maybe catchers. But I've had a catcher come in. Scotty Madison was on that first slide. He played with Bo Jackson, Pete Rose, Vandy Hall of Famer. Had bilateral knee replacements. They couldn't get him to full extension. I was able to do it in about 20 minutes. But the next day they were going to put him under anesthesia, rip everything in the way. So we've also got to think too with these kids, how much are we sacrificing their health now just to win those games? Because as you all know, once your elbow or shoulder hurts from even playing at the high school level, that doesn't go away. That hurts you for the rest of your life. So think, if you're a dad and you want to play with your kids, or you're training these kids or coaching these kids, and someday they might want to throw with their kids or coach and want to be able to throw batting practice, just think, why are we pushing it there? So you can see the hip sockets, it's called the acetabulum. We've got one that's facing more to the side, kind of lateral, and one that's kind of more anterior and down. So when you've got, especially these popular trendy programs that are telling you need a certain amount of mobility. I've had a $200 million quarterback. I've had probably a dozen world champions in Bellator, UFC, submission grappling. Those guys require a crazy amount of flexibility. None of them have anywhere close to 90 degrees of hip internal rotation. I've had one guy, I've been doing this for 22 years, one guy, and he was a video gamer that never played any sports. You try to have that guy run sprints or do something athletic, it's going to be a disaster. So not just the hip socket, if we look at the femurs, you can see the neck of the femur, so you got the ball, and then you got the neck that goes down. You can see how some of the lengths are different, some of the thicknesses are different, but then also the angle of it. So we've got these structural deviations that we need to always remember. Just because some athletes can get into that position, it doesn't mean that every athlete needs to get into that position, because again, structure dictates function. I was at a certification way back, and we'll touch on this too, and they want us to front squat. I said, hey, it's not happening. I said, oh, well, gently force it. I said, stop. Gently and force don't go in the same sentence when we're talking about anatomical function. That's just, it's ignorant, it's dangerous. I said, unless you get a chisel and a belt sander, we chip away some of that bone why do we want to get to this position anyway? There's so many other ways we could load for this exercise. And then not only that, how much compression is there at this joint, at these joints, and then also we're just cranking those into end range. And remember, once those forearm flexors fatigue, elbow stress goes up. So if we're doing this and shutting these kids down, and I've seen it on there's a popular book, popular program, not knocking the guy, but he's got a front squat on there. There's so many different ways we can apply force with so many different tools. We've got to get away from some of these things. And then the snap it. I see some of you guys have pens out. Go ahead and put a pen in your top hand like this. Very basic, structure dictates function. Humor me for a second. Show me how you're going to make contact with a baseball. We can't stop the clowns, but we can stop watching the circus. All right? So when you've got these kids that are coming in, and then guess what? The structure of the spine and those facet joints and the vertebrae, you're just asking for a lateral bulge. And what happens when you give them nerve damage or permanent structural damage? Again, Is anybody going to make contact with a baseball like this? Even if you go like this, it's just not going to happen. So a lot of the stuff you see on social media, unfortunately, gives people a voice that shouldn't have one. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of injuries. And again, once that kid gets injured, because now he's done some damage to radial ulnar or elbow, then what? Then he can't play, all because we were chasing this new shiny concept like a fishing lure. So we've got to remember, structure dictates function. Please always remember that with your athletes. Here, this guy played AA with the Astros. I think it was in Corpus Christi. So we're always told that this is good for balance, right? Good for balance, stability, good for your feet, your lower leg. So I'm asking Shay, he's got great control. We see a lot of physical therapists do this, which is still pretty disappointing, but a lot of strength coaches too. So when your kids ask you, why aren't we doing what we see the influencers doing? He doesn't have a foot. He doesn't have a leg. Can somebody tell me how that's going to build stability in your athlete when you can just compensate through the hip? Again, there's no foot or leg. So we can compensate. That's what we do as athletes. So we're doing all this unstable and shaking things and having seizures with new pieces of equipment and things like that, or thinking that we're going to build stability on these air bladders. You're not. You're just reinforcing compensation patterns, because neurologically the brain knows if those guys aren't fit to participate and they're shut down from stress, trauma, or overuse, and in baseball it's typically overuse, right? And then we put them on an unstable surface. Instability plus instability is a mess. And all you're doing is magnifying that compensation pattern. And when those joints hold more tension and pull tighter, you lose more range. Then you're trying to beat them up, smash them, stretch them to get that range back. So again, there's no foot or leg, and he's able to do it by compensating through his hip. So think about that with how we're training these athletes. If there's not a stable platform for them to adapt to, you're never going to get them more stable. There's another, if we're taking friction away, or we're removing friction from the back leg, I'm sure we all wear cleats, right? Well, you kind of want to grip the ground. You can stop, start, run faster, prevent injury. So if we're trying to get that ground reaction force and push, then we can also look at rotation. Rotation going this way is not going this way. And I saw an influencer, one of their guys posting, I really feel that in my back. Yeah, you're going to feel some hardcore arthritis and degenerative joint issues with those facet joints and the structure of the vertebrae. So think, structure dictates function. Rotation going this way is not rotation going this way. I'm not saying it's not a last second compensation, but to train that, it's pretty ignorant. We've got to do better. And it's not you guys, it's what you guys are having to fight against. You've got these kids coming to you. We've been talking to some coaches, getting some great insight of, our kids ask us why we're not doing this. We tell them, hey, structure dictates function. If you want to break your spine, I joke with my athletes, when they start getting real into mobility, I say, just jump in front of a bus, break everything. You'll be the most flexible person in the world, because that's all you want, right? Range of motion. So again, mobility without stability, vulnerability. We've got to make sure we have muscle tension. So with distance running, a lot of times we hear that it's to get the lactic acid out. We've known since the 1930s, a study done in the Harvard Fatigue Lab, it'll metabolize within about an hour. So for your pitchers, going back to playing while fatigued, 36 times higher risk of overuse injury. Again, I don't know how they came up with that figure, but still alarming. And I know firsthand because every season my arm was wrecked, because I'd get there and we'd have timed 2-mile runs, or we're having to run before or after. So it's not a complex sport to train for. We're just overthinking it. And a lot of what we see on social media kind of bleeds over, and we think, well, maybe we should try that. And they might have pictures with some big name athletes. Okay, every now and then even a blind squirrel finds a nut. We don't hear about all the failures. So just because they have a couple successes, we don't get to hear about all the failures, and we're going to touch more on that. So again, throwing while fatigued increases arm stress. So if we're doing a lot of running or conditioning before we want these guys to throw, the arm's going to have to work harder, because from the ground up, we're more fatigued. So before the game, it's going to negatively impact their performance and, of course, increase fatigue. So we're almost setting them up for failure there. And the failure may not happen that day. But you know what? If we have more accumulated stress over time as far as that chronic workload. And another issue you guys have is travel ball. You don't know how much these kids are playing outside of what you're doing. So it kind of, not to say it takes away from some things that you want to do, but just something to be mindful about, because the more fatigued you are, the more stress it's going to be when you're throwing. Distance running after the long day of practice, we always talk about recovery now. So if they've already gone through this game, let's say they pitched or caught, and they're already probably pretty fatigued, they've got to go get their recovery in. So if we're just sending them out to do some mindless running, what is the point? We just saw, and a lot of you probably already know, that the lactic acid metabolized in the body within about an hour, and that's even just sitting there. Sure, you can get it to go away 15 to 20 minutes faster with running, but we've got to keep these athletes healthy. Another thing, a lot of these guys I get a lot of injured athletes from these top velocity chasing programs all the time. 1 to 2 weeks after they blow out their arm, or they had to have surgery as a result of that. And when they get there, the assessments are very poor at best, to put it nicely. Because again, I get these kids a lot. I get them, after they were injured. Sometimes I get them before they're injured, and I look at their training program. And a lot of them, don't even have that trunk rotation to their throwing side, or they don't even have retraction. They're in a poor scapular neutral position, which again is going to cause impingement. So every step that we're taking, it's kind of like having a bad alignment on a car. We've got to check for that. But if they do have some kind of asymmetry, and they're going to because it's baseball, then I'd say no human is perfectly symmetrical. But the problem with that is rep after rep after rep, we're going to magnify that compensation or that asymmetry, so we're tightening those joints up more. And then what do? We stretch and beat the crap out of them and repeat the process. So that is force into the nervous system, force into the muscular system, and that's what's going to drive up the arm stress and lead to injuries. Maxing out in the weight room, you guys have probably seen this video of Acuna. They ask him, what's your max bench and squat? He says, I don't do that. It's probably not that good of a baseball player, huh, if he doesn't lift heavy. Malachi Cloud, Lee University in Tennessee. I was talking with one of the parents. You can see some of his accomplishments there. Great ball player. I heard from some of the other college coaches in that conference. He was I think he was runner-up for freshman of the year. My client ended up getting it with the 10 complete game shutouts, no injuries at all, no problems. So they're in the weight room. They want him to max out on a deadlift. When in sports do we do this? If we lift up one leg, what happens? Now all of a sudden everything changes. So we constantly have that pelvic shift. We have trunk rotation. It's a very explosive and dynamic sport. So they want him to max out on a deadlift. Again, the kid's got draft interest, freshman. He tore his labrum. Got the MRI, torn labrum, can't play. You know what the coach said? Bummer. What is the point of maxing out? Okay, you want to know what their 5-rep max is. Let's make it easy. Have them do 5 reps, increase the weight, increase the weight. Rip my pec right off the bone from a strength coach. Would have never maxed out. No point. 0 point. How much does a bat weigh? How much does a ball weigh? So again, I've been through that too. My pec was ripped off for about 2 years. Still fought in some tournaments, went back to play baseball when my pec was ripped off. And the final nail in the coffin for me, we have to have that reciprocal motion. But because my pec was ripped off, pec major, pec minor pulled tight. So as this is cycling through, I didn't have that reciprocal motion. So my hamstring ripped pretty badly. So I go to the PTs and they say, oh, your hamstring was weak. Incredibly ignorant statement. The hamstring was working so hard and pulling so hard that that's why it ripped. We exceeded what that could do because we didn't have that reciprocal motion. So again, had I been doing a lot of distance running, that would have just magnified it. With the Olympic lifting, what's the goal? We've got to really think what's the goal. And then also on the structure dictates function part, if we're trying to get down into a low range, why? I know that when I started doing heavy lifting in high school, again, I've got longer levers, so I got to produce more torque. So mechanically, at the bottom of a squat, I suck, and that's okay. It's basic resistance mechanics. So we've got to think about better ways to apply force. I've seen a lot of injuries from the high schools in our area. The strength coaches, they'll have them use a hex bar and jump up and, try to stop before hitting the ground. So force is mass times acceleration. If I place a 5-pound weight on my foot or I drop a 5-pound weight on my foot, it's the same, right? No. So that mass times acceleration, think of that. So how many pounds of force, if they're jumping up and trying to stick a landing with 200 pounds, how much force is that and what are we risking tearing? And again, why? What is the point? There's really no point. As far as the counterproductive load adaptations, the more force we're putting into the muscular system, guess what? It's going to tighten up as an adaptation because you keep putting that load in as the stimulus. All right, so if you see little meatheads, how they're tight, right? Because they're always doing their bicep curls, so they lose elbow flexion. So if we're doing all this heavy lifting, of course the hips are going to tighten up. And then we go back to the 90-90. Again, you saw structure dictates function. There's a lot of structural deviations and differences in the shapes of these athletes' bones. So we just kind of repeat the cycle of, beating them up more and more. It's baseball. We gotta back off and be a lot more efficient. Concerned with velocity-based training. Again, force is mass times acceleration. So, heavy or weighted balls, we could be a lot more efficient with them. We know that peak stress happens as we get to end layback or max external rotation to acceleration, right? And then we see studies that weighted balls can increase external rotation. So if peak stress is happening in this range back here, and then we want to open that up, does that sound like a good idea? Probably not. So we've got a greater range where stress is higher. And again, structure dictates function and muscle stabilized joints. So if we're already going into a passive range, and the elbow is a hinge joint, it does flexion extension. So as it's going back and the humerus torques forward with the mass of this plus the ball, and we've got that dynamic valgus, if we're throwing with that, we could potentially get some good adaptations, but at what cost? So that's what we've got to think about. Personally, I think the best thing we could do with them is just flip them up like this. That's it. If we're doing forearm training, using a bar, we're missing that point of application of force that we would have with the ball, with the baseball. So we can flip up something heavy, and then just because we don't want to put any more extra stress on this elbow, again, it does flexion extension, so we can fire it down from here and really use our forearm flexors, and there is no varus or valgus stress on that elbow. So that's a good way to get those positive adaptations and respect the structure. All right, so again, we can keep a lot of stress off the connective tissue. Motion capture. Have you ever seen a mechanic watch your car drive down the street and tell you what's wrong inside the engine? That's not possible, right? So motion capture, it's a tool. It'll tell us how things are moving. It doesn't tell us why they're moving. So that's kind of where I come in, or hopefully we've got a great network too, so if you need help, please let us know. But it tells you how it's moving, it doesn't tell you why it's moving. So if they say, okay, your arm slot dropped, is it glenohumeral? Is it scapular? Is it lateral flexion? Had a kid from Vandy that was throwing 100. From what I hear, he was better than Bueller and Leiter back in the day. And then he's with the Rome Braves, struggling to hit 91, 92. So he comes in, been to the labs. He's had a lot of lat tears, a lot of shoulder injuries. So he comes in, and we're going over his injury history. So I said, when's the last time you rolled your ankle? Of course, he didn't remember when he did. He said, it was about 2 years ago. It's about the time he started having issues. So we do a lot of positional tests. He can't hold a single positional contraction with his foot or lower leg. Motion capture didn't show that. So he's essentially standing in a sand pit trying to get ground reaction force because he can't create a rigid lever. Motion capture is not going to tell you things like this. Again, it's a tool. It'll show you how things are moving. It's not going to show you why. So with the trends and fads, we've got to get away from, Brian, can you please play that video? Here's one. So look at the end where the load ends up. Right here. We've got half the load on one side of his neck, half the load on the other side. Why are we exploding like that and putting all that stress on his cervical area? It's dangerous, it's ignorant, it's going to hurt these kids. To post things like this, it's embarrassing. It's disappointing to baseball. It really is. So when we're getting creative like that, we've got to think, if we just think basic resistance mechanics, we can look at, what is the load? What's the line of force? What's the point of application of force? What's the axis? Moment arm, lever arm. So it's very complex, but we've got to stop using these trendy things and trying to be explosive with them. Because at that end range, for his cervical spine, when you hurt that kid's neck, he's probably not going to play baseball, and that's probably a lawsuit waiting to happen. But that could be permanent structural damage for the rest of his life. Don't tell me you train pro athletes when you do like this. Pardon my French. It's laughable. What happens when one of them rolls their ankle or breaks their ankle? That's on you. So this is what you coaches are having to fight against. So not only that, what if a kid falls and breaks his arm? I've seen athletes get injured. There's no integrity in this at all. If you're looking at a parent in the eye and telling them you're going to make their kid better, and that kid trusts you, that parent trusts you, even worse, a coach trusts this, it's disappointing. There's no reason for this at all. If a trainer did this in my facility, you better have your stuff and get out the door before I get you out the door. It's negligent, it's ridiculous. So we got to think about, what these popular programs are doing, and then again, there's no accountability. Biotensegrity, big buzzword, means everything's connected. There you go. The more we hear these big words, there's an absence of logic and understanding of resistance mechanics, and it's quite obvious. We talk about fascia. People always want to cite, Tom Myers from anatomy trains, and he says he's pulling back, top speed and reverse because it doesn't do half the things that people say it does. And also, again, range of motion requirements. Anybody who loves to cling to the word fascia, it would take well over 2,000 pounds of force. That's what they've stretched it with, and you don't even get a 1% change in length. And depending on the tissue, muscle or tendon, a 1% change in length is a strain or a sprain. So is that what you're going for? Is anybody in here capable of producing over 2,000 pounds of force? I'll go with probably not. If you put that force into an athlete, what do you think is going to happen? Something's going to break. So we see that, very large forces outside normal physiological range are required to produce even 1% compression, 1% shear in TFL, fascia lata, and plantar fascia. So it's just not going to happen. So I can share this paper with anybody and everybody who's interested, because again, if we're talking about these things, it means they don't understand resistance mechanics. And that's a big problem, and that's why we're seeing all these creative things that are going to injure athletes. Baseball innovations used to be played without a glove. So we're getting a lot of hands breaking, a lot of fingers breaking. So they invented the glove, and they called it sissy mittens and said it was unmasculine, right? So we have this force. So this was to solve that problem and absorb the force. This is kind of like a car shock. This would be a compression force. So having these kids come in injured with the skill set, knowing every superficial muscular attachment, structure, function, even the physics or resistance mechanics, having these kids come in, I thought, okay, I've got to do something because I know we can offload stress externally. Again, that's a passive range. We know where peak stress is the highest, and that's how I come up with the Kinetic Arm. So we've got a muscle on our lower body called the sartorius, and I'm talking with one of those influencers, I was kind of mentioning earlier. I asked him, do you know where that attaches? No. I asked him if he knew where other muscles attached. No. So again, it's just a reminder that a lot of what's been going on doesn't need to happen. So with this, we go back into that passive range. Now we can offload stress in that passive range. We can also offload stress from that posterior shoulder. So what the Kinetic Arm does, it's not going to let the arm lag behind. And then if you have that anterior tilt, now we're getting posterior impingement with this posterior acromion on that humeral head. So it's going to create more of a distraction force. So it's going to cause biceps tendonitis and a slap tear. So now we can use this as an active constraint and prevent that. Not to mention reducing that dynamic valgus. Got a lot of great research from University of Texas at Tyler that an athlete with a slap tear, put it on him, was able to finish out the season pain-free. I'm not saying put this on your injured athletes. I'm just saying it's a great tool. You can use it for chronic workload management, definitely for injury prevention if you want to get the safe and sustainable velocity increases. If your kids are set on chucking weighted balls, it's a great way you can offload stress and potentially get that positive adaptation without as much risk. And then long toss as well. It's a great way to train the body from the ground up so they can throw harder and not wreck the arm. The pro guys that use it, they say when they use it in between starts, it cuts the recovery time almost in half. We've got coaches that use it to throw batting practice. 300 balls every other day, 75-year-old coach, no arm pain. So it's a great tool to keep your athletes healthy. And again, you don't know what they're doing in travel ball. You don't know what they're doing on their own with their friends. You don't know what they're doing at some of these facilities. Then you'll see Brittany Dowley's name on there too with the American Baseball Biomechanics Society. So I'd love to keep in touch. We can do a follow-up after this. They said there's another room we can go to. So if you guys have time, I'd love to show you some of the positional isometrics. So instead of a reverse throw where our shoulder's already in a compromised position, and again, force is mass times acceleration, if we're exploding from here, we still have stress. That's a distraction force at the shoulder and the elbow, right? We already have enough stress, arms are breaking down already. We don't need to do that. If we retract, abduct, and apply force there, and we'll go over the sequence and how much force to produce, and then how neurologically we can get the post-activation potentiation, and we'll save the big words for down there. I don't use those to try to impress people. Again, that's a lack of education when you hear things like that. But keep in touch. We'd love to help out any way we can. Thank you guys very much for your time, and if you have any questions, I'd love to follow up and answer them in the other room.